You're live.
Good morning. Welcome to the House Environment Committee. This morning, we are going to hear a couple of amendments to S212. Welcome, Representative Olson.
Well, thank you, and good morning. Thanks for taking the time to hear me. Yes, I have an amendment on the calendar to H 212. The substance of this amendment is word for word the text that is in H 746, an act related to water and wastewater permitting. It's to that effect. And that bill is something that I put together with a couple of different groups. One, a number of regional planning folks across the state, and as well as some engineers who do water and wastewater design and implementation. And both of these folks are very supportive of the notion that we can make some revisions to some of the permitting rules that will both maintain our protections for environmental issues, not to mention public health issues, which are certainly involved with water and wastewater systems. And we can do that while at the same time trying to do a better job of balancing our need for housing in the state. And I come from a rural town, so that's really particularly acute. Especially, it's particularly acute, but it's the same, in non-rural parts of the state too. So that's the gist of it. I think we need to do a better job of balancing our commitment to protecting our environment and public health with Vermont's desperate need for more housing. I think for too long we've been in sort of silos, conversational silos, and in one corner of the boxing ring or whatever, you have folks that are very intent, as they should be, around maintaining our environmental protections, not to mention, public health kinds of issues. And in the other corner, you got, we need more housing, and it's been a little distressing that they sort of talk past each other quite a bit. And I think we have to have kind of a different mindset around trying to reconcile these issues. And so that's why I introduced the bill. And frankly, that's why I'm proposing the amendment to 212. I'll rely on Michael to go through the specifics of the bill. It's a series of changes, mainly to the chapter that deals with water and wastewater permitting. Actually, we'll probably, I'm anticipating dividing the question, so we focus on those first. And then there's some other issues which deal, frankly, with areas of the law that aren't really in sync with part of this amendment, and I recognize and acknowledge that. So that's it in general. Happy to answer any questions for the specifics. I'm familiar with the bill, but Michael can certainly do a much better job on the details.
Thank you. I think, we'll let Michael walk us through the differences between what we have and what you've proposed.
Thank you.
Members have any specific questions for Representative Olson? We'll get to the details of the amendment with council.
Thanks very much.
Good morning. This is Michael Grady with Ledge Council. Just to provide context of what you did in S212. You required the agency to issue a general permit for new connections to new existing structures, which is already a permit requirement, but the general permit and the directive under it to give deference to licensed designers and engineers and to come up with a manual that will provide better guidance for those doing connections. That was a large part of what your bill did. You also did the authority to delegate pre-treatment discharge to municipalities from ANR to the municipality. Representative Olson's amendment largely addresses potable water supply and wastewater system permits. And the way that I drafted the amendment, I was able to meld what you did for potable water supply and wastewater permits with what Representative Olson did in his bill H746. So that's what the first two instances of amendment do. They both amend 10 VSA Chapter 64, potable water supply and wastewater permitting, and combine your changes with Representative Olson's changes. So you will see in that first instance of amendment on page 1, it amends the purpose section for that chapter. And your purpose section had struck what was subdivision 1971-6, which allowed for full delegation to municipalities. And you struck that because you're not doing full delegation anymore. Instead, you put in that the purpose of the chapter was to authorize general permits for more effective and efficient permitting of potable water supply and wastewater system. That is unchanged. What is being changed in that section is what is in subdivision 1, Representative Olson's directed that part of the purpose of the chapter is to encourage construction of housing and foster economic development while also protecting human health and the environment. So that's the first instance of amendment. The second instance of amendment amends the permit requirements for potable water supply and wastewater system permits. Remember, that's where you put your general permit. That's where you struck that partial delegation for designated downtowns. That's where you gave the discretionary general permit authority for subdivision and boundary lines and small wastewater and small potable water supplies. So that all remains. What is being changed with regard to Representative Olson's amendment would be on page 2 in the list of permits that are required under the chapter, that in modifying an existing building or structure in a manner that increases design flow or modifies other operational requirements, provided that when the use of an existing permanent potable water supply used for a public benefit, such as a school, is altered for use for another public benefit, the secretary is not going to require redesign of the supply or require additional capacity for the supply. That is a situation that's occurred in a couple of places, like think Sterling College. Public purpose use as a school, has a wastewater system. The town wants to use it for another public purpose. Do they have to go through a whole redesign of that system? And that this would address that type of situation. Moving on.
Hold on a second. So currently, do they?
They would have to, yes, because they have to basically account for what their use is going to be and what flow is necessary to meet that use.
So if the flow was the same or less, would they still have to redesign it? This is
No, they don't have to redesign it, but they would need to get a new permit.
okay. So the permit is confirming that the existing capacity meets the new demand.
Yeah.
And so this would delete that.
Well, not necessarily. You would still need a permit. You just wouldn't need to redesign it.
What if it needed redesigning?
You wouldn't need to redesign it underneath this.
Like, what if it needed to meet capacity?
Well, I think that that's probably going to be the discretion of the professional engineer at that point, because remember, their license and their fact that they have to certify the system is part of this program. And so they would have to certify that the system is sufficient to provide the necessary public water supply.
It's like Mr. Redmond has some thoughts on this. Did you want to say something?
For the record, Brian Redmond, representing the Drinking Water and Groundwater Protection Division. The programs that have advantage is our WW program, these permits. So under the current regulations, there's many permit triggers and rules, but 2 of them that are really foundational to the program are increases in design flow change in use that modify the operational requirement of the system or supply. So if those triggers don't occur, if there's a change in the building and there's no change in the increase in the flow or a modification of the operational requirement, there is no permit required. It's when you increase the flow or change the characteristics such that it puts different demands on the system or supply is when the permit would be triggered.
Thank you.
To move on. On page 3, lines 1 through 7, there's already language in the chapter that you can see beginning on page 2, going on to page 3, where the secretary is required to give deference to certification by a licensed designer. You will see that on page 3 that Rep. Olson wants to be clear that this section shall allow the secretary to issue a permit based on the certification by a licensed designer of record drawings or the design of a wastewater system or potable water supply without
So
individual.
where are you reading? I'm lost.
Page 3,
Line 3.
line 3 through 7.
It's at the bottom going over this.
So this would allow the secretary to issue a permit based on a certification by a licensed designer. It is similar to what you did in your general permit language where you direct the secretary to give deference to the certifications by a licensed designer. But deference is not the same as issuing the permit based on certification. So this would allow the secretary to issue those permits just based on the certification. It is fairly consistent with the existing language, but it goes just a little bit further.
Sorry, when you say existing language, you mean in our bill or in statute today?
In statute already.
But this is already able to be done.
If you look at page 2, it says this bottom of page 2, line 18, the secretary shall give deference to a certification by a licensed designer with respect to the engineering design or judgment of the designer in order to minimize agency review of certified design. This goes a little bit further than that deference and says that they shall issue those permits or allow the secretary to issue those permits based on a certification.
Representative Chapin.
Sorry, just to clarify for us, I know we've seen a lot of amendments lately, but I'm not clear on this. So F1 is in statute or is in our bill, and how do we tell the difference in this document? What is our new language that's not passed into law yet that's in our bill versus what's in statute, or can we not?
Well, F1 is largely not underlined. The language that is underlined, that's Representative Olson's proposal. Your proposal for the general permit and the deference for that is on page 4. That is on line 8 at page 4.
Everything on page 4 is underlined. Does that mean it's part of Rep. Olson's?
No, everything on page 4, everything on page 4 from line 6 going on to page 5 is your language.
Why is it underlined in this? I'm sorry, I'm confused.
Because he's inserting it. And
He's striking out the entire section and replacing it with, no, he's striking the entire section and including additional language in the section plus the
Okay.
language that we had in there.
Okay, so underlined could be either Rep. Olson's language
Yes.
or ours.
I melded the two proposals because they were literally amending the same sections. So,
You're just gonna walk us through and tell us what you.
right.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry for the confusion.
Representative Logan.
Our bill strikes out on line 2, I'm sorry, page 2, line 18. Our version of the bill strikes out the 1, and this does not. Because we had proposed to delete other subsections.
So you struck out the 1 because you also struck the 2 entirely. And Representative Olson uses the 2 to add new language. And so you don't strike the 1 when you have 2.
I mean, Representative Austin.
You know, this might be a big ask, but I just don't, would it be possible to get a side by side between our bill and Rep. Olson's amendment?
Always possible, yep. But let's try to get through this and see if we still need it.
Okay.
Have you done a side by side, Michael?
No, not of this. Page 3, line 8, this is language that you struck from your, in your bill. This is that language that allows for connections in those designated downtowns and municipalities to issue those connection permits. That is being struck in both your version and in Representative Olson's amendment, but Representative Olson is adding the language at the bottom of page 3. When the secretary issues a permit for a new or modified connection to an existing permitted indirect discharge system, the approval of the connection shall not require reissuance, reevaluation, or modification of the existing permitted indirect discharge system.
All right, what does that functionally do?
So indirect discharges are discharges effectively to groundwater for systems that are 6,500 gallons per day or more. And so basically for a new connection to that existing permitted indirect discharge, the approval does not require reissuance or modification of the permit. You just are allowing a connection to that existing indirect discharge system.
Mr. Redmond, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, Reverend Brian Redmond, I see this being a fairly significant gain here. Just to remind folks, these are larger capacity subject systems. Speed areas, connections can range dramatically in size and scale and scope, the infrastructure that's required. And just to remind folks, that's part of the reason why we have the may use deference in the general permit language, because there was this whole discussion about not every connection is the same and there's significant complexity variation. So, you know, I haven't had a time to really digest this language, but it appears fairly significant in terms of its scope and effect.
Representative Austin?
Yeah. I'm assuming capacity would also be an issue with this amendment. I mean, in terms of if it's new, do we know if the capacity of the treatment center could hold that capacity, treat that capacity? Is that accurate?
Right, that's part of the permit review, and this would be saying that review would not occur. So capacity is one of the key issues. And then, of course, the other issue is just the technical layout of the connection itself. So those two things are really what our design manual are going to focus on.
The design manual and the general permit would cover some of these types of connections already in our proposed bill.
Correct. The scope it's kind of two really big pieces of the design manual. The first is to bring the standards forward into more engineering drawings and graphics. So bringing those standards forward. And then the second big piece is this discussion about what it means to have the capacity to serve a new connection, what it doesn't need for the agency to provide additional guidance on that question.
Any other questions on this section?
Moving on page 4, line 6, this is language from your report where secretary shall adopt a general permit for the connections. That is all unchanged, including on page 4, line 15 to 21, the discretionary authority the secretary has where she may adopt general permits for subdivisions, for boundary line adjustments, for small water supplies, and then on page 5, line 3, small wastewater systems. What is new on page 5 is line 9 through 14. This is language proposed by Rep. Olson when issuing a permit for an indirect discharge system. Secretary shall require an easement or other permanent legal access only to the indirect discharge system in the disposal area, and an easement or other permanent legal access shall not be required prior to issuance of the permit for every potential service connection from a building or structure to the indirect discharge system. There's concern that when you're trying to permit these indirect discharge systems, that you have to figure out every potential connection, and that can be problematic in the permitting of the system
What other connections would be there?
to any existing structure that, so these aren't like water line, these or wastewater system lines, I should say. These are large community-based indirect discharge system. And so a municipality might not have a requirement that you must connect to it. So you might have your own septic system, but in developing the system, there's potential that you would connect to it. And so they look to see what legal access is necessary for every potential connection.
It's demonstrating legal access to the area where the infrastructure is located. It's a requirement. So in case of a connection to an indirect discharge system, the line going from the building to the indirect discharge system, you'd have to demonstrate either permanent legal access or easement in order to use, own, operate, maintain long-term those assets. So that's part of the current permitting process.
And this would negate that.
Not necessarily. It would only require when you're going to have the actual connection, not when you have the design of the system and the proposal of potential connections.
What is the problem you're trying to solve, Representative Olson?
So this was offered by some engineers who thought that the basic design would cover these kinds of issues, and that adding another layer of permitting it functionally wasn't serving a whole lot of more purpose. At least that's what these folks are proposing. I understand the agency has a different perspective on this. So the question from their minds was, why go through this other layer when you have a general permitting process that should be able to take care of it? It's a time and, again, it's about, from my perspective, it's about how do you get more housing, try to obviate a little bit of the time and costs that might go into building that house.
I agree with that sentiment, and I think we try to run these kinds of procedural steps as concurrently as we possibly can. But what should be noted here is if you don't have this solidified for your project and you move forward with permitting, bidding, that's done at risk. Because if there's a significant change, that would require you to move back in the process to navigate that change. We've seen that happen on several occasions.
So moving on from there, page 5, line 15, you're moving into the third instance of amendment. You're no longer melding your language with Rep. Olson's language. This is all new in Rep. Olson's proposal. And the first is amending the rules requirements for potable water supply and wastewater systems to require certain changes to those rules. Page 6, line 1. So for performance standards, there would also be performance standards for the maximum application rates for the sizing of a leach field for a wastewater system based on soil texture and soil structure. For design flow, page 6, lines 4 through 15, there would be design standards for construction of wastewater systems underneath basically impervious or paved surfaces. That's actually possible, and it's done in other jurisdictions. There would also be design flow specific to systems serving compact housing. small homes or community systems. There would also be standards for reduced capacity requirements for wastewater systems using water-saving devices. And then design flow requirements for community-based water systems that replace on-site wastewater systems that reflect the actual flow for living units served and not the basically the default standards that are used in the rules. And then on page 6, line 16, there would be design requirements, including isolation distances, provided that if the wastewater systems that include a leach field and a mound, the rule shall allow any fill material that lists the ASTM International spec for C33 or type 2 soil standard. That C33 is the type 2 soil standard, but there are 2 other types of soil standards, and depending on your system and your sites, you might have to meet the other soil standards, and this is saying you can use C33.
Yeah, Representative Chapin.
So for this entire page of edits, it's my understanding A&R could, these are all including, so A&R could choose to develop these design standards in their process. Is that accurate?
Yes, this
Regardless of whether we made this change.
well, when you go back to the intro language on page 5, the secretary shall adopt, and these rules shall include. So this would be a mandate. But they do already have the ability to do performance standards, do design standards, capacity standards. They can do that already. And the rule is a very long, complicated rule. And so there's already some of that in there, but not to the specificity.
Was this adding anything that A&R couldn't already do?
It's not adding anything that they couldn't do. It's telling them they have to do it.
And I have a question about water saving devices, because we were going online to buy a new shower head and Vermont was restricted by water saving device requirement online. You were on the list of states that you had to buy a certain type of shower head. And I'm curious, like, do we already do that? Where is that? Maybe that's a question for you, Michael. Seems like somewhere someone has tagged us as a low flow shower head.
That is probably under the building code / plumbing code and how it has been incorporated by basically fire safety, public buildings. I can't even begin to tell you how hard it is to discern because they just cross-reference the national codes and say this national code section applies, but this one doesn't. And so you have to cross-reference what they adopt with what the national code is. By the way, the national codes aren't public. So you have to pay for them. And so it's really hard.
Sorry to digress. Do members have, did you want to comment on this section? Okay.
So moving on to page 7, there would also be performance standards, design requirements, and design flow standard for compact wastewater systems that use advanced filtration technologies such as aerobic treatment, biofilters, compact leach fields, or drip irrigation. Any standard shall allow for importation of materials into the state for the design and installation of the compact wastewater system. So that might be where you're seeing some conflict with the building code and them not allowing certain things to be used in the state, but this would allow for that compact wastewater system.
I would just comment that we do have an innovative and alternative technology program currently in place, and we may call it in the previous section. example is the leach fields under parking lots. That's currently under review. We had some questions for that submittal that we've commented on and waiting for information. And similar to new types of wastewater system technology, we have an approval process in place for approval of those types of new technologies.
For Mr. Redmond, I would assume that any of those systems would have gone through really rigorous review as to whether they were Vermont wanted to allow them. Is that correct? And do we allow them?
We do have an approval process on our website. There's a list of the technologies that we've reviewed and approved. They go through the technical advisory committee for review and approval. So there's a pretty robust process to get them reviewed and approved. Once they're reviewed and approved, then they require renewal. So there's a process in place, and yes, we do. It's a very important aspect of the program is to keep up on the technological advancements.
So these that are being proposed, are they permitted? These biofilters, compact leach fields, aerobic treatment units, drip irrigation, are those all already approved?
Would have to analyze this particular, like drip, for example, is approved. Drip is approved. I would have to analyze the other list. Typically, it's the manufacturer, the distributor that's going to come to the program. And certain consultants have used these technologies in other jurisdictions, which they bring them to Vermont. We analyze and review them for their availability and use here. And then again, go through this approval process, which we're doing right now with the leach fields under parking lots. And then that, once the approval's in place, it would require renewal. So we're doing a robust review plus keeping track of it as it's in use over time.
And so if it stopped at filtration, advanced filtration technologies and didn't list specific types of systems, would that be okay?
That's our decision.
Okay,
So what this really would do is it would take it away from the alternative and innovative technology process and require them to put in to the rules specific standards for specific types of these systems. And so it wouldn't be use by use, site by site review for the alternative technology. The standards would be in the rules for those alternative technologies. Should I move on? You can go to page 9. This is adding a new section regarding isolation distances. The isolation distances in Vermont, depending on what your system is, where your system is, how big it is, the geographical site constraints can vary significantly, especially around proposed existing or permitted drinking water sources. And it's not a default. You have to look at a table to determine what X, because X might be your isolation distance, but it also might be Y, depending on the narrative about which gets applied X or Y, depending on your site conditions or the size of your system. So in other states, there is, and this is in the agency's point of view, this is a health-based system. But other states don't have that system. For example, New Hampshire just has a default isolation distance. And so what this would do would be to establish a default isolation distance so that the minimum horizontal isolation distance between all components of a wastewater system and a potable water supply, including the source, shall be 75 feet unless based on the specific site conditions, the secretary determines that a greater isolation distance or isolation zone is necessary to prevent potential subsurface flow of effluent from impacting a potable water supply, prevent the potable water supply from impacting the performance of wastewater system, or protect human health and the environment from a threat or potential threat of contamination posed by the construction techniques or material used in the wastewater system or the potable water supply. So the secretary would still have some discretion to require larger, effectively environmental or public health based isolation distances, but you wouldn't have to do the X versus Y determinations.
Is there a minimum isolation distance now?
From wastewater systems, water supply, it's usually 100, 200, depending on type of supply and the elevation changes and the subsurface geology.
Yeah. I guess I would say we had really great testimony from this program about the complexity of Vermont's geology and why we are not like every other state that may have different ways of doing this. If you're stumbling on this, I recommend going back and watching that presentation. It's very, very informative. All right.
Moving on, page 10, section 4C is a transition and implementation section directing the Secretary of A&R to consult with the Technical Advisory Committee. That's a committee that's established by statute to work with the Secretary and provide expert advice on potable water supply and wastewater issues. So they will consult with the TAC regarding the rulemaking that's required that you just walked through. And on or before January 1, 2028, the Secretary amends the rules in order to ensure consistency with the requirements of the Act. And then on page 10, line 12 through 16, potable water supply and wastewater system permits shall be issued under DEC's current wastewater rules until the rules are amended for consistency with the requirements of the Act, or until July 1, 2027, whichever occurs first. And then the fourth instance of amendment, you're moving out of potable water supply and wastewater system permitting, you're moving into wetlands, water quality, and Act 250. This is applying that deferential standard that you saw underneath the potable water supply and wastewater system, that the agencies can rely on a certification from a professional engineer. So you can see on page 11, notwithstanding the requirement for a permit to be issued by the Secretary, for a permit to conduct an activity in a wetland or wetland buffer zone, no permit shall be required for the siting of a leach field in the buffer zone of a fast tube wetland when the leach field is part of a wastewater system permitted by A&R. And then on page 12, this is basically a 15-day comment period for new indirect discharges. That would shrink the comment period by 15 days. Page 12, section 4F, this is Act 250. No permit or permit amendment is required for the construction of improvements for water or wastewater infrastructure serving a village and downtown center. And then
No, I'm sorry, how many more changes in the Olson?
the rest of these are all Representative Olson's.
Okay, so I don't want to just breeze through them. We need to go to the floor. And we're gonna take a